Margaret Hale was 32 years old when Blackwater Shipping Company forced her from the keeper's cottage, where 3 generations of her family had faithfully watched over Greyhaven Harbour, accusing her of negligence after a disastrous shipwreck caused by a beacon they had secretly allowed to fall into disrepair. She carried nothing into the cold coastal wind except 6 worn silver coins tied inside her late mother's embroidered handkerchief, a weathered leather satchel filled with family keepsakes, and the quiet determination that had survived every hardship life had already placed before her. While the townspeople whispered that grief had finally clouded her judgment, she walked into the county auction and used every coin she possessed to claim an abandoned lighthouse, standing alone on Blackstone Point, a lonely stone tower that had remained empty for 18 years after being condemned as too dangerous, too costly, and too forgotten to save. The auctioneer barely hid his amusement as he handed her the faded deed, and even those who pitied her believed she had traded her last chance at survival for nothing more than cracked stone, broken windows, and memories buried beneath dust. Yet far above the winding staircase, inside the silent lantern room where no keeper had climbed in nearly 2 decades, something waited beneath weathered oak and rusted iron that had escaped every inspection, every storm, and every greedy hand searching for profit. Hidden there rested the missing testament of Judge Elias Thornton, a document capable of exposing a conspiracy powerful enough to reshape the history of the entire coastline and restore justice to families who had unknowingly lived beneath the weight of stolen truths for almost 20 years. Before another sunrise had passed, men who believed that testament had vanished forever would begin searching for the lighthouse once again. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Hale. If you're watching from a place that sometimes feels forgotten by the rest of the world, tell us where you're joining us from in the comments, because stories like this remind us that forgotten places often carry the greatest treasures. Long before anyone spoke of abandoned towers, missing judges, or forgotten testaments, Greyhaven Harbour was known as one of the safest ports along the rugged northern Atlantic coast. Sailors often said they could recognize its welcoming shoreline long before dawn, because the lighthouse on Blackstone Point never failed them, its steady beams sweeping across the restless sea every evening with the quiet certainty that only faithful hands could provide. To strangers, the lighthouse was merely another navigational landmark, standing proudly against cliffs carved by centuries of relentless waves. To the people who called Greyhaven home, however, the tower represented something far greater than stone and lantern glass. It was a promise that no matter how fierce the storm became or how dark the night appeared, someone remained awake while everyone else rested, watching over lives they might never personally know. Margaret grew up believing that promises mattered because both of her parents lived according to them every single day. Her father, Samuel Hale, had served beside the elderly lighthouse keeper Benjamin Whitlock for nearly 3 decades, learning every gear, every polished brass fitting, every oil reservoir, and every hidden corner inside the great tower, until he understood the lighthouse almost as well as he understood his own family. Samuel believed that careful work revealed a person's true character, not because anyone praised it, but because faithful service protected people who might never realize they had been protected at all. Whenever Margaret accompanied him during his inspections, he reminded her that the brightest achievements in life often went unnoticed simply because they prevented disasters before anyone realized danger had existed. Her mother Abigail carried that same quiet spirit into the small keeper's cottage, resting below the tower. She filled the modest home with fresh bread, warm soup, and steady kindness that reached far beyond her own family. Fishermen returning from difficult voyages often found warm meals waiting at their table before they reached their own homes. Widows whose cupboards had emptied during harsh winters discovered baskets of food left anonymously outside their doors before sunrise. Traveling sailors remembered Greyhaven not only because of its dependable lighthouse, but because someone there always treated strangers as neighbors. Abigail never considered generosity an extraordinary act. She simply believed every community survived because ordinary people chose compassion long before anyone asked for it. Margaret absorbed those lessons as naturally as she learned the rhythm of the tides. By the age of 8, she already recognized approaching weather simply by studying the changing colors across the horizon. At 10, she could polish brass until it reflected faces like a mirror. At 12, she helped organize decades of weather journals, carefully preserved inside the Lighthouse office, fascinated by the way simple observations recorded over many years revealed patterns invisible to hurried eyes. While other children chased gulls across the docks, Margaret found herself drawn toward quiet responsibilities that most people overlooked. She enjoyed repairing worn logbooks, cleaning navigation instruments, cataloging supply inventories, and carefully preserving old maps whose edges had begun to crumble with age. Benjamin Whitlock often smiled whenever he discovered her quietly working without being asked. The elderly keeper rarely offered compliments, yet when he did, they carried lasting weight. One chilly autumn evening, after Margaret spent nearly 3 hours restoring damaged pages inside an old harbour register, Benjamin gently closed the book and looked toward the fading sunlight spilling through the lantern room windows. "Most people believe great things are built by great moments," he said softly. "But history survives because someone cared enough to preserve small things before they disappeared." Margaret never forgot those words. Every lesson inside the lighthouse seemed connected by the same simple truth. The great Fresnel lens required every crystal prism to remain clean because even one neglected surface weakened the light. The heavy clockwork mechanism demanded careful winding each evening because missing a single night could leave sailors blind during dangerous weather. Every polished bolt, every cleaned window, every recorded weather report mattered because small acts repeated faithfully eventually became the foundation upon which entire communities depended. Among the regular visitors to Greyhaven Harbour, none interested Margaret more than Circuit Judge Elias Thornton. Unlike many government officials who hurried through coastal towns as quickly as possible, Judge Thornton often remained several extra days after court concluded, walking the docks, speaking with fishermen, and climbing the lighthouse simply to watch the evening beacon begin another night's watch. He believed a judge understood people best when he listened long before making decisions. Samuel respected him deeply because Thornton possessed an unusual habit rarely found among powerful men. He asked questions before offering opinions. During one of his visits, the judge noticed Margaret sitting quietly beside the lighthouse window, writing inside a small notebook. Curious, he asked what occupied her attention so completely. Margaret answered without hesitation. She explained that she had begun recording unusual tides, changes in bird migrations, conversations among sailors, and small observations that seemed unimportant individually, but might someday explain larger events. Thornton studied her notebook carefully before smiling with genuine admiration. Reaching into his satchel, he removed a beautifully bound leather journal and handed it to her. "Keep filling pages," he encouraged warmly. "People remember dramatic events because they are loud. Truth usually survives because someone patiently recorded ordinary days." Margaret accepted the gift with both hands, treasuring it more than anything she had ever owned besides her mother's handkerchief. From that day forward, she rarely walked through Greyhaven without adding another careful observation to its growing collection of notes. She documented incoming ships, weather changes, repairs completed around the lighthouse, unfamiliar visitors arriving by carriage, damaged docks awaiting maintenance, fishermen helping one another after storms, and dozens of other details most people never noticed. She never imagined those habits would someday become the very skills capable of separating truth from deception. Life unfolded peacefully for many years, beneath the faithful turning lantern atop Blackstone Point. Spring brought wildflowers across the cliffs, and seabirds returning to familiar nests. Summer filled the harbour with merchants, fishermen, and travellers seeking safe passage northward. Autumn painted the surrounding forests in warm gold, before Atlantic storms tested every vessel brave enough to remain at sea. Winter covered the lighthouse with snow, while its steady beam continued sweeping across icy darkness, exactly as it always had. The people of Greyhaven rarely questioned whether tomorrow would resemble yesterday, because the lighthouse remained constant through every season. Children grew into adults beneath its light. Sailors departed beneath its light. Families welcomed loved ones home beneath its light. Margaret believed that such dependable things would always remain beyond the reach of greed or ambition. She believed honest work naturally earned respect. She believed promises once made would always be honored. She believed powerful people understood the responsibility that accompanied their influence. Above all, she believed the lighthouse belonged to the people whose lives it protected, rather than those who merely counted profits upon distant ledgers. She could not yet imagine that danger would arrive not with roaring waves or violent storms, but with polished boots, expensive coats, legal documents, and smiling men who claimed they wished only to modernize Greyhaven Harbour for the benefit of everyone, while quietly measuring every inch of land according to the fortunes it might someday produce. Those men carried maps instead of lanterns, contracts instead of compass charts, and calculations instead of compassion, and although the townspeople welcomed them with hopeful curiosity, the old lighthouse seemed almost to stand a little quieter whenever they passed beneath its shadow, as though stone remembered truths that people had already begun forgetting. The prosperity promised by Blackwater Shipping Company arrived so gradually that almost no one questioned it during the beginning. New warehouses appeared along the waterfront. Fresh timber lined the docks. Merchants spoke excitedly about larger markets, and hopeful families imagined that Greyhaven Harbour was finally stepping into a brighter future. Only a handful of people noticed that every improvement seemed to point away from Blackstone Lighthouse instead of toward it. Margaret Hale noticed because she had spent her entire life observing the details everyone else overlooked. She saw surveyors measuring the cliffs surrounding the lighthouse far more often than they measured the harbour itself. She noticed company officials studying property maps while pretending to admire the scenery. She watched expensive carriages climb the winding road toward Blackstone Point, even though none of their passengers ever entered the lighthouse. Her father, Samuel Hale, noticed the same things but carried his concerns with quiet restraint. One evening, while the two of them climbed the spiral staircase carrying fresh oil for the great lantern, he paused beside one of the narrow windows overlooking the restless Atlantic. Below them, waves burst against the granite cliffs with the same steady rhythm they had followed for centuries. "People believe greed always arrives shouting," Samuel said softly, watching the white spray disappear into darkness. "But it usually arrives smiling. It shakes your hand before it reaches for what belongs to someone else." Margaret remembered those words because her father rarely spoke from suspicion. Every lesson he offered had been earned through long years of patient observation. She asked whether he believed Blackwater meant to harm the lighthouse. Samuel remained silent for several moments before answering. "I believe they see land where we see responsibility. That difference worries me more than any storm." The lighthouse continued its faithful work, despite shrinking support from the county. Supplies that once arrived every month began appearing every 3 months. Replacement glass requested for cracked lantern panels remained delayed. Orders for fresh whale oil were reduced without explanation. Maintenance crews never arrived despite written promises. Samuel documented every shortage with remarkable care, recording dates, signatures, quantities, and conversations exactly as he had always done. Margaret copied every report into duplicate journals, believing that careful records protected honest people. The replies always sounded reassuring. Budgets required adjustment. Transportation difficulties had delayed shipments. Engineers would inspect the lighthouse soon. Each explanation appeared reasonable by itself, yet together they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Benjamin Whitlock, now well into his 70s, finally accepted retirement after serving nearly half a century as Greyhaven's lighthouse keeper. The town gathered beneath clear autumn skies to honor the quiet man whose steady hands had guided generations of sailors safely home. Fishermen removed their hats, while children carried flowers to the old keeper's porch. Benjamin accepted every kind word with humble gratitude before placing the ceremonial brass lighthouse key into Samuel Hale's hands. "The tower isn't yours," he whispered gently. "You're simply the next man trusted to protect it." Samuel nodded solemnly, because he understood exactly what Benjamin meant. A lighthouse was never owned. It was borrowed from future generations. Margaret assumed many of the daily responsibilities as her father's assistant. She maintained weather journals, polished the great Fresnel lens until it shimmered like crystal, inspected emergency supplies, cleaned every brass fitting inside the lantern room, and preserved decades of harbor records stored beneath the office stairs. The work suited her perfectly because it rewarded patience instead of speed. During those peaceful months, Judge Elias Thornton continued visiting Greyhaven whenever his circuit brought him along the northern coast. Unlike many officials who hurried through every assignment, Thornton always climbed Blackstone Lighthouse before leaving town. One evening, he stood beside Margaret, watching the lantern complete another slow rotation above the dark sea. "Do you know why this light has lasted longer than governments?" he asked. Margaret smiled thoughtfully. "Because someone cared for it every day." The judge returned her smile. "Exactly. Civilization survives for the same reason." Before departing, he handed Samuel another sealed envelope bearing only his signature across the wax. "Keep this where careful people keep important things," he instructed quietly. "I pray no one ever needs it." Samuel locked the envelope inside a sturdy oak cabinet beneath years of weather journals, without asking a single question. Margaret never learned what rested inside because she trusted both men enough not to satisfy her curiosity. Winter passed quietly, followed by a spring rich with seabirds and calm seas. Yet beneath Greyhaven's peaceful appearance, another current slowly gathered strength. Victor Ashcombe, Blackwater Shipping Company's regional director, began attending nearly every town council meeting. He spoke persuasively about modernization, efficiency, and the future. According to him, the aging lighthouse occupied valuable land, better suited for expanded shipping facilities. Modern steel navigation beacons, he argued, required fewer keepers and less expense. Several council members agreed. Samuel respectfully disagreed. During one public meeting, he explained that machines followed instructions while experienced keepers exercised judgment. Storms rarely behaved according to engineering diagrams. Human lives depended upon decisions no automated beacon could ever make. Many townspeople applauded his words, yet Margaret noticed Victor Ashcombe smiling calmly throughout the discussion, as though he already knew how the story would eventually end. Summer faded into another storm season. Powerful Atlantic systems rolled toward Greyhaven, one after another, sending enormous waves crashing across Blackstone Reef. Samuel and Margaret worked tirelessly through countless nights, inspecting gears, cleaning lenses, trimming lantern wicks, and ensuring every mechanism performed exactly as designed. Despite dwindling resources, the lighthouse continued protecting sailors because faithful hands compensated for missing supplies. Fishermen often remarked that they trusted Samuel Hale's light more than any chart ever printed. Those words filled Margaret with quiet pride. Then came the storm that would divide her life into everything before and everything after. The cargo steamer Northern Grace approached Greyhaven shortly after sunset, carrying lumber, machinery, and 23 crew members. Heavy rain reduced visibility, while fierce winds pushed the vessel steadily toward Blackstone Reef. Samuel lit the great lantern hours before darkness, as he always had. Margaret completed her inspection of every prism, every oil reservoir, every gear, and every emergency supply. Everything functioned perfectly. Shortly after midnight, the lantern flickered once. Margaret looked upward immediately. It flickered again before the brilliant beam suddenly faded into darkness. Samuel rushed toward the burner assembly, while Margaret seized emergency lamps. Within seconds, they discovered the impossible. Every reserve oil container had somehow been contaminated with water and sediment thick enough to choke the entire fuel system. Samuel had personally inspected those supplies only 2 days earlier. They had been perfectly clean. Working frantically beneath pounding rain, father and daughter dismantled valves, cleaned filters, and attempted to restore pressure while Margaret repeatedly climbed onto the outside gallery, holding emergency signal lamps above the storm. Freezing wind tore at her coat while towering waves exploded against the cliffs below. She swung warning lights toward the invisible sea until her shoulders burned with exhaustion. Somewhere beyond the darkness came the terrible sound every coastal family feared more than thunder. Wood splintering, iron tearing, men shouting across violent water. Then silence swallowed everything except the roar of the sea. The northern grace had struck Blackstone Reef. Before dawn, Greyhaven's fishermen launched rescue boats, despite impossible conditions. Ordinary men risked their own lives pulling exhausted sailors from freezing water while waves smashed the cargo vessel against the rocks, until little remained except broken timbers scattered across the surf. Some crew members survived because of extraordinary courage shown by the fishermen. Others never returned home. The town mourned deeply, believing nature alone had claimed another heartbreaking price. Margaret knew better. The lighthouse had not failed because of age. It had not failed because her father neglected his duty. Someone had deliberately ensured the beacon would disappear when it was needed most. Samuel intended to prove exactly that. Before he could begin his own investigation, county officials arrived accompanied by Blackwater Shipping Company representatives. Their inspection lasted less than a single afternoon. Without interviewing fishermen, without examining Samuel's years of maintenance records, and without acknowledging repeated requests for replacement supplies, they released an official report declaring poor maintenance and obsolete equipment responsible for the disaster. Samuel calmly presented copies of every inspection report he had filed during the previous 5 years. Margaret produced duplicate journals documenting delayed shipments, contaminated deliveries, and unanswered maintenance requests. Victor Ashcombe accepted the documents politely before assuring everyone they would become part of the official investigation. They were never mentioned again. Local newspapers repeated only the company's conclusions. Within 14 days, Samuel Hale was dismissed as lighthouse keeper for negligence. Nearly 3 decades of faithful service vanished beneath a single signature. Greyhaven's most trusted guardian became the convenient man blamed for a tragedy engineered by people whose influence reached far beyond the small harbour. Margaret watched her father descend the lighthouse staircase, carrying only his weathered toolbox, Judge Thornton's sealed envelope, and the quiet dignity that honest people often possess when false accusations leave them with nothing else. He paused once at the doorway, turned toward the great tower that had shaped his entire life, removed his cap, and whispered a farewell that only Margaret heard. Neither of them realized it would be the last time Samuel Hale ever stood inside Blackstone Lighthouse as its keeper. Margaret believed losing the lighthouse would become the hardest day of her life. She discovered she had been wrong only 3 weeks later. Samuel Hale never recovered from the weight of the accusation placed upon his name. Although the people who knew him best continued greeting him with respect, he carried the quiet sorrow of a man whose life's purpose had been taken away through dishonesty instead of failure. Every morning he still rose before sunrise, as though preparing to inspect the beacon, only to remember that another man now held the brass key to the tower his family had served for generations. He spent long hours repairing fishing nets for neighbors who could barely afford to pay him, refusing charity while quietly accepting whatever honest work appeared. Margaret watched the change with growing concern. Her father had never feared hard labor, but he struggled with idleness forced upon him by men who had never climbed the lighthouse stairs during a winter storm. One cool October evening, while sitting beside the small fireplace inside the keeper's cottage they had been allowed to occupy temporarily until legal ownership transferred, Samuel reached into his coat pocket and removed Judge Elias Thornton's final sealed envelope. He studied the unbroken wax seal beneath the firelight without opening it. Margaret asked whether the judge had ever explained why it should remain hidden. Samuel slowly shook his head. He simply said, "Careful people should protect it until the proper time arrived." Margaret suggested perhaps the proper time had come. Samuel smiled gently, but returned the envelope to the oak cabinet, where it had rested for months. "Truth," he answered quietly, "must never be opened simply because we're desperate. It deserves better reasons than that." Those became some of the last words Margaret would ever hear her father speak. Early the following winter, Samuel suffered a sudden illness, brought on by weeks of exhaustion, grief, and relentless work beneath freezing rain, repairing damaged fishing boats after another fierce coastal storm. Greyhaven's physician did everything he could, but years of labor, disappointment, and heartbreak had quietly worn away the strong man Margaret had always believed impossible to break. Before dawn on the fourth morning, Samuel Hale slipped peacefully from this world, while his daughter held his weathered hand beside the window overlooking Blackstone Point. His final glance rested not upon the room around him, but toward the distant silhouette of the lighthouse, standing dark against the grey Atlantic sky. Margaret buried her father beside her mother Abigail, beneath the windswept cemetery overlooking the sea they had both loved so faithfully. Nearly the entire town attended, despite the false accusations that still stained Samuel's official record. Fishermen removed their hats. Children placed wildflowers beside the modest headstone. Even Benjamin Whitlock, now walking with a cane, climbed the steep hillside simply to stand beside the grave of the man he had trusted like a son. No representatives from Blackwater Shipping Company appeared. Victor Ashcombe sent only a brief letter expressing routine condolences. Margaret folded it once, placed it inside the fireplace, and watched the paper disappear into ashes without reading beyond the opening sentence. After the funeral, she returned alone to the keeper's cottage, where silence had replaced every familiar sound. Her mother's rocking chair stood beside the window, exactly where it had always rested. Her father's weather journals remained neatly arranged across wooden shelves. The polished brass compass Samuel had carried for decades reflected afternoon sunlight exactly as it had the day before. The house no longer felt empty because someone had died. It felt empty because the quiet routines that once filled every corner had vanished with him. During the following weeks, Margaret attempted to continue earning a living by repairing navigation charts, copying shipping manifests, sewing sails, and assisting widows throughout Greyhaven whenever they needed another pair of hands. Most families gladly offered work, but it rarely lasted long enough to provide lasting security. Meanwhile, Blackwater Shipping Company moved quickly. Since Samuel no longer occupied the keeper's cottage under his employment agreement, the company claimed legal authority over the property surrounding Blackstone Point. Notices arrived ordering Margaret to vacate within 30 days. She appealed before the town council, explaining that her family had maintained the lighthouse for nearly 70 years. Victor Ashcombe responded politely that sentimental history could not outweigh contractual obligations. Several council members looked uncomfortable but remained silent. The eviction proceeded exactly as planned. Margaret packed everything her parents had left behind into 3 wooden trunks, preserving every weather journal, every family photograph, every navigation chart, and every small keepsake carrying memories impossible to replace. Among those belongings, she carefully wrapped Judge Thornton's still-sealed envelope inside Abigail's embroidered handkerchief, before placing both inside her leather satchel. She did not know why she continued protecting it. She only knew her father had trusted her to do so. On the final morning, she stood alone outside the cottage, while hired workers replaced the Hale family name above the doorway, with a temporary company notice declaring the property scheduled for redevelopment. She looked once toward Blackstone Lighthouse. Its lantern remained dark. Broken windows reflected nothing except passing clouds. Seabirds circled lazily above the abandoned tower that had once guided hundreds of ships safely home. Margaret whispered a quiet farewell before walking down the cliff road carrying every possession she still owned. Winter settled heavily across Greyhaven. Margaret rented a tiny room above Mrs. Eleanor Briggs' bakery in exchange for helping prepare bread before sunrise. The arrangement provided shelter but little income. Every evening she walked the harbour, simply to quiet her restless thoughts. She often found herself staring toward Blackstone Point, where the abandoned lighthouse continued standing alone against the horizon, like an old guardian everyone had forgotten. Children invented ghost stories about the tower. Travelers asked why such an important landmark remained abandoned. Local fishermen simply shook their heads before changing the subject. Nobody wished to discuss the place anymore, because doing so reminded them of everything the town had quietly surrendered. Then, early one spring morning, notices appeared throughout Greyhaven, announcing a county auction. Several neglected government properties would be sold to recover unpaid maintenance expenses. Most people paid little attention until someone noticed Blackstone Lighthouse listed among the final parcels. The announcement spread rapidly across town. Some speculated wealthy investors planned to purchase the cliffs for resort development. Others assumed Blackwater Shipping Company would reclaim the property for almost nothing before expanding its shipping warehouses. Margaret read the notice 3 separate times before carefully folding it into her pocket. That evening, she climbed the hillside cemetery, carrying fresh flowers for her parents' graves. Sitting quietly between the 2 weathered headstones, she spoke aloud for the first time since Samuel's passing. "They'll erase everything if no one stands in their way," she whispered, while looking toward the distant lighthouse rising above the sea. The wind answered with the familiar sound of waves striking granite below. Suddenly, Benjamin Whitlock appeared, slowly walking up the hill with his cane. He lowered himself carefully onto the grass beside Margaret, without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he reached inside his worn coat and placed 6 silver coins into her hand. Margaret stared at them in confusion. "These belong to your father," Benjamin explained gently. "He left them with me after the eviction. He said if Blackstone Lighthouse ever stood alone again, they were to help someone faithful bring the light home." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. 6 coins cannot buy a lighthouse. Benjamin smiled beneath his grey beard. "Perhaps not." He looked toward Blackstone Point, where gulls circled above the lonely tower. "But sometimes everyone else has already decided something has no value." Auction day arrived beneath overcast skies and a stiff wind blowing inland from the Atlantic. Farmers gathered, hoping to purchase unused pasture. Merchants bid on storage buildings. Shipwrights competed for old workshops near the docks. Margaret remained quietly near the back of the crowd, holding her leather satchel tightly beneath one arm. Hours passed before the auctioneer finally announced the abandoned lighthouse property. He described cracked masonry, unsafe stairs, broken windows, damaged lantern equipment, and costly repairs required before the structure could legally reopen. One by one, prospective buyers studied the weathered survey before quietly lowering their bidding cards. Victor Ashcombe stood confidently near the front, apparently expecting no competition. The auctioneer opened bidding. Silence answered. He lowered the starting amount. Still no response. More warnings followed about liability, restoration expenses, and structural uncertainty. Several people quietly laughed, wondering who would willingly purchase a crumbling tower everyone else considered worthless. Margaret reached into her satchel, wrapped her fingers around the 6 silver coins Benjamin Whitlock had returned, remembered every lesson her parents had taught about protecting things others overlooked, and slowly raised her hand. The crowd turned almost as one. Victor Ashcombe looked back with visible surprise before allowing himself a faint smile of amusement. The auctioneer repeated her offer twice, waiting for another bid that never came. His gavel struck the wooden block with a sharp echo that seemed to drift all the way toward Blackstone Point. "Sold." The single word hung in the cool sea air, while astonished whispers spread through the gathering. Margaret Hale had just become the owner of the abandoned lighthouse everyone else believed beyond saving, never imagining that, high above the forgotten spiral staircase, inside the silent lantern room, where dust had rested undisturbed for nearly 2 decades, another inheritance had been waiting patiently for the one person still willing to climb toward the light. Margaret remained kneeling beside the old storage cabinet, long after the wind outside had settled into its slow evening rhythm. The lantern in her hand cast trembling shadows across the circular walls, making the dust seem almost alive as it drifted lazily through the stale air. Every instinct her father had patiently taught her urged caution, rather than excitement. Samuel Hale had often reminded her that old buildings revealed their secrets only to people willing to move slowly enough to notice what hurried eyes ignored. She raised the lantern higher and carefully examined every inch of the cabinet. Unlike the warped shelving downstairs, its oak boards remained remarkably straight despite nearly 2 decades of abandonment. The iron hinges carried only a light coat of rust, far less than every other piece of metal inside the tower. Someone had cared enough to oil them years after the lighthouse officially closed, yet no official record mentioned anyone entering Blackstone Lighthouse after the county sealed it. Margaret brushed away layers of dust with the sleeve of her coat until the cabinet door became fully visible. The brass handle had darkened with age, but faint scratches surrounded the keyhole, as though different keys had unsuccessfully searched for entry over many years. She gently tested the handle. It refused to move. Kneeling lower, she examined the lock itself. It differed from every other lock inside the lighthouse. Samuel had replaced nearly all the tower's original hardware during routine maintenance before Blackwater Shipping Company ever arrived, yet this lock appeared considerably older, hand-forged rather than factory-made, with tiny initials almost hidden beneath corrosion. She cleaned the surface carefully with the edge of her handkerchief until 2 letters emerged beneath the tarnish. E.T. Margaret's heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. Elias Thornton. Judge Thornton. The initials matched the name engraved inside the leather journal the judge had given her many years before. She reached into her satchel almost without thinking and removed that same weathered notebook. Though its leather had softened with years of use, the gold letters pressed into its cover remained faintly visible beneath the lantern's glow. E.T. Exactly the same style. Exactly the same careful craftsmanship. She compared the lettering silently before placing the journal back into her satchel. This cabinet had belonged to Judge Thornton, or at least it had been secured by him. Yet why would a circuit judge install a private cabinet inside a lighthouse instead of the courthouse where official documents normally remained? The question settled heavily upon her thoughts. She searched her memory for every conversation Thornton had shared with her father. He had visited often. He always climbed the tower before leaving Greyhaven. He had spoken of records, of preserving ordinary truths, of careful people protecting important things. Suddenly, those conversations no longer sounded philosophical. They sounded deliberate. Margaret carefully ran her fingertips along the edge of the cabinet. One side felt strangely colder than the surrounding wood. She tapped lightly. A hollow echo answered from somewhere behind the thick oak panel. She frowned. The cabinet appeared built directly against the circular stone wall, yet the sound suggested empty space where solid granite should have been. She stood slowly and examined the surrounding masonry. Every stone around the cabinet carried decades of salt stains, except one narrow section hidden completely behind its frame. There, faint mortar lines differed ever so slightly from the rest of the tower, not enough for a casual visitor to notice, more than enough for Samuel Hale's daughter. She smiled sadly. Her father would have found it immediately. Buildings speak, he had often told her while teaching repairs. Most people simply never learn their language. Margaret fetched a small pry bar from Samuel's old maintenance bench below and returned carefully to the lantern room. She worked patiently, avoiding unnecessary force. The cabinet itself deserved preservation, whether it concealed anything or not. Nearly half an hour passed before one of the lower mounting brackets shifted slightly beneath steady pressure. Then another followed. Finally, the entire cabinet moved barely half an inch away from the wall, with a dry groan that echoed through the silent tower. Cold air drifted through the newly opened gap, carrying the unmistakable scent of sealed wood and ancient paper rather than damp stone. Margaret froze. Air should not have remained trapped behind an ordinary cabinet for 18 years. Someone had intentionally sealed whatever rested beyond it. She widened the opening another few inches until her lantern illuminated a narrow recess carved directly into the lighthouse wall. It was scarcely wider than her shoulders, yet extended deeper than the lantern's light immediately revealed. Dust covered the entrance, but unlike the room surrounding it, the floor inside the recess appeared strangely clean. Not recently cleaned. Protected. The air itself felt untouched by time. Margaret crouched carefully and extended the lantern into the opening. Shelves emerged from darkness one after another, built from cedar remarkably preserved by the dry enclosure. Most stood empty, except for scattered fragments of wax, a rusted ink bottle, and several rolled navigation charts, so brittle she dared not touch them immediately. At the far end rested a small iron-bound sea chest, no larger than a traveling trunk. Unlike everything else inside the recess, the chest remained wrapped beneath thick canvas, coated with hardened beeswax to resist moisture. Whoever had hidden it had intended it to survive for generations. Margaret's pulse quickened, not from thoughts of treasure, but from recognition. Samuel had preserved important weather journals beneath waxed cloth, exactly the same way whenever storms threatened flooding. Someone who understood preservation had prepared this hiding place. She carefully lifted the canvas. Dust rose softly before settling again across the floor. The chest itself bore no decorative carving, no family crest, no official seal. Only a simple brass plate, secured to its lid, carried an inscription, worn almost smooth by time. Margaret cleaned it gently, until the words slowly appeared beneath the lantern light. To be opened only by honest hands. She read the sentence twice. No lock guarded the lid. Instead, a heavy leather strap, wrapped around the chest, had been secured with faded red sealing wax, bearing the unmistakable impression of Judge Elias Thornton's official judicial seal. Margaret stared at it in disbelief. The missing judge's seal had reportedly vanished on the day Thornton disappeared, nearly 19 years earlier, while traveling between coastal towns. Newspapers had speculated about robbery, shipwreck, even murder, yet no trace of him had ever been discovered. Authorities concluded that whatever documents accompanied him had been forever lost. Yet here, hidden inside Blackstone Lighthouse, rested a sealed chest carrying the very seal everyone believed had vanished with him. Margaret reached toward the leather strap before stopping herself. Samuel's voice returned as clearly as if he stood beside her. Truth deserves patience. She withdrew her hand. Whatever waited inside had remained hidden almost 2 decades. Another few hours would not erase it. Instead, she carefully examined the recess itself. Along the inside wall, she discovered shallow pencil marks, recording dates stretching across several months during the year before Thornton disappeared. Beneath each date appeared tiny initials matching different coastal towns, followed by numbers that seemed unrelated, until Margaret recognized them as parcel references copied from county land ledgers. Judge Thornton had been investigating property records, not merely traveling his judicial circuit. The realization sent a chill through her. Someone had not simply hidden personal belongings inside the lighthouse, they had hidden evidence. Real evidence. Evidence carefully catalogued by a judge known throughout the northern coast for refusing bribery, regardless of consequence. Outside, unseen beneath the darkness gathering across Greyhaven Harbour, another lantern suddenly appeared, moving slowly along the cliff road toward Blackstone Point. Margaret remained unaware that while she knelt inside the hidden chamber, studying Thornton's mysterious markings, someone else had already begun climbing the path toward the abandoned lighthouse. Margaret listened instinctively, convinced for a brief moment that the distant sound belonged only to the wind moving through the iron gallery above her head. She remained perfectly still, allowing the silence to settle before trusting her own hearing. Her father had taught her long ago that the sea often disguised footsteps, and that patient listeners always discovered the difference. Then she heard it again. Slow, deliberate, gravel shifting beneath heavy boots somewhere outside the lighthouse. Someone was climbing the narrow path from the cliffs. She gently lowered the lantern flame until it burned dimmer, casting only enough light to see the hidden chamber before her. Every instinct urged her to close the cabinet immediately. Yet another instinct, older and quieter, told her not to disturb anything until she understood exactly what she had found. She carefully covered the iron chest once more with the waxed canvas, making certain every fold rested exactly where she had first discovered it. Then she eased the cabinet back toward the wall until only the slightest opening remained, enough for her to reach it again without forcing the old brackets. Just as she finished, the unmistakable creak of the lighthouse entrance echoed faintly upward through the spiral staircase. Margaret held her breath. The heavy front door had opened. Whoever had entered knew enough not to slam it against the stone walls. They moved carefully, almost respectfully. A lantern glowed somewhere below, its faint light circling slowly across the lower level before beginning the long climb upward. Margaret quietly extinguished her own lantern. Darkness immediately swallowed the lantern room, leaving only pale moonlight filtering through cracked glass panes above. She stepped silently behind one of the great iron support columns surrounding the old Fresnel lens. Years of assisting her father during nighttime inspections had taught her exactly where shadows remained deepest when moonlight entered from the eastern windows. She waited without moving. The approaching footsteps paused on nearly every landing, as though their owner examined each floor before continuing upward. Whoever it was had not wandered inside by accident. They were searching. The climb seemed endless. Each footstep echoed softly against the circular stone walls before fading into silence again. Margaret counted them unconsciously. 23, 38, 51, 64. Whoever climbed knew the staircase well enough to avoid broken boards she herself had carefully stepped around only hours earlier. Finally, a lantern glow appeared beneath the final curve of the staircase, leading toward the lantern room. Margaret could now distinguish the outline of a man carrying a walking cane in one hand and an oil lantern in the other. Relief swept across her almost immediately. "Benjamin?" she whispered cautiously. The old keeper looked upward in surprise before smiling warmly. "I thought I might find you here." Margaret stepped from the shadows, exhaling the breath she had unknowingly held. "You frightened me." Benjamin chuckled softly. "I'm afraid old knees make poor burglars." He reached the lantern room, placing his lantern gently upon the floor, before looking around the space with quiet admiration. "You've already brought more life back into this place than anyone expected." Margaret hesitated only briefly before leading him toward the partially moved cabinet. Benjamin noticed the shifted brackets immediately. His expression changed. "You found something?" Margaret nodded slowly. Without speaking, she pulled the cabinet aside once more, revealing the narrow hidden recess beyond. The old keeper remained completely motionless. For several long seconds, he simply stared into the concealed chamber, as though seeing a familiar face after many forgotten years. Finally, he removed his cap. "So, it really existed," he whispered almost to himself. Margaret looked at him with surprise. "You knew about this?" Benjamin slowly shook his head. "Only rumors. Judge Thornton once asked me whether every lighthouse built before the Civil War contained emergency storage recesses inside the lantern rooms. I told him many of the older towers did, though most had been sealed during renovations. He never explained why he wanted to know." Margaret pointed toward the iron-bound chest resting beneath the waxed canvas. "His judicial seal is still intact." Benjamin approached carefully but made no attempt to touch it. "Then whatever rests inside has never been opened." His voice grew quieter. "Not by anyone." Margaret told him everything she had discovered, from the initials carved into the lock to the hidden dates and parcel numbers penciled upon the recess wall. Benjamin listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more thoughtful with every detail. When she finished, he remained silent for nearly a full minute before speaking. "The year Judge Thornton disappeared," he said carefully, 3 farming families lost land they insisted had belonged to them for generations. The court ruled against them because official county deeds suddenly showed different ownership. Then the same thing happened to 2 fishing cooperatives farther north. People complained, but every record supported the new owners. Eventually, everyone accepted that the documents must have been genuine. Margaret frowned. "But what if they weren't?" Benjamin looked toward the hidden chest. That is exactly the question I believe Judge Thornton intended someone to ask. He knelt beside the recess, studying the faded parcel references Margaret had discovered. His finger paused over one particular number before his eyes widened slightly. "This parcel belonged to the Rowan family," he murmured. "Their orchard became Blackwater's first warehouse." Another number caught his attention, and this one. This belonged to the church that once stood beside Harbour Creek. Margaret suddenly understood. These were not random records. They formed a pattern stretching across nearly the entire coastline. Piece by piece, property after property, ownership had quietly changed hands shortly before Blackwater Shipping Company began its remarkable expansion. Judge Thornton had been tracking every transfer. "He wasn't hiding from criminals," Margaret whispered. "He was gathering proof." Benjamin slowly nodded. "And someone must have realized it." The old keeper rose carefully to his feet and turned toward the lantern room windows overlooking the sleeping harbour below. Tiny lights shimmered peacefully across Greyhaven, unaware that the answers to questions buried for almost 20 years rested only a few feet away. "Margaret," he said quietly, "whatever is inside that chest is no longer simply your discovery. If Judge Thornton truly preserved evidence here, there will still be people who desperately wish it had never survived." Margaret looked once more at the unbroken judicial seal. She suddenly realized why her father had never opened the judge's final envelope, why Thornton had spoken so often about patient truth, and why the lighthouse itself had remained so important long after its beacon went dark. It had never been only a lighthouse. It had been the safest vault along the northern coast, hidden in plain sight where only someone who understood its purpose would ever think to look. Neither Margaret nor Benjamin noticed the distant figure standing motionless near the base of Blackstone Point, watching the faint glow inside the lantern room, before quietly turning back toward Greyhaven with urgent news for Victor Ashcombe. Margaret scarcely slept that night, though exhaustion tugged heavily at her body after an entire day of climbing staircases, clearing debris, and reopening rooms abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Her thoughts refused to rest. The hidden chamber behind the lantern room cabinet had transformed everything she believed about Judge Elias Thornton's disappearance. What had once seemed a tragic mystery now resembled the deliberate silencing of a man who had ventured too close to a dangerous truth. Yet the unopened chest remained where Thornton himself had left it, protected by an unbroken judicial seal that had somehow survived 18 winters, countless storms, and the slow decay of time. Margaret sat quietly beside the cold lantern room windows, watching the eastern horizon gradually surrender to dawn. The sea below remained calm, its grey surface reflecting the first pale streaks of morning. She remembered countless sunrises spent beside her father, in this very room, while Samuel recorded wind direction, tide levels, and visibility before lighting the great Fresnel beacon. "Every sunrise deserves a witness," he had often said. "It reminds us the world always begins again, no matter how difficult yesterday became." This sunrise felt different. For the first time since Samuel's death, Margaret no longer felt like someone merely surviving another day. She carried a responsibility larger than her own misfortune. Somewhere inside the iron chest rested the reason Judge Thornton had trusted the lighthouse above every courthouse, every bank, and every government office along the northern coast. Benjamin stirred from the wooden chair where he had insisted on remaining through the night, despite Margaret's objections. The old keeper stretched slowly before noticing she was already awake. "You never slept," he observed. Margaret smiled faintly. "Neither did you." Benjamin laughed softly. Old men and old lighthouses both have trouble sleeping. They shared a quiet breakfast of bread, cheese, and dried apples Benjamin had thoughtfully brought from town before returning their attention to the hidden recess. Morning sunlight now filled the lantern room, illuminating every detail that darkness had concealed. The iron-bound chest appeared even older beneath natural light, its brass fittings dulled by age but remarkably free from corrosion. The red judicial wax seal remained perfectly intact across the leather securing strap, bearing the unmistakable scales of justice pressed deeply into its surface. Benjamin removed his spectacles and studied it closely without touching. "There is only one reason Thornton would leave this seal unbroken," he murmured. "He wanted whoever opened it to know that no one, not even he, had altered what rested inside after sealing it." Margaret nodded slowly. "If we open it, we become the first people to see whatever he considered important enough to hide." Benjamin looked thoughtfully toward the harbor. "Then we should have witnesses." By mid-morning, Benjamin had quietly invited 3 people he trusted without reservation. Reverend Thomas Caldwell arrived first, carrying little more than his weathered Bible and decades of quiet integrity. Though age had bent his shoulders slightly, his reputation throughout Greyhaven remained beyond question. Shortly afterward came Dr. Eleanor Pierce, the town's physician, whose precise record-keeping and unwavering honesty had earned everyone's respect for nearly 30 years. Finally arrived Martha Rowan, now nearly 70, whose family orchard had been one of the first properties absorbed by Blackwater Shipping Company, under circumstances many townspeople had privately questioned, but never challenged publicly. None of them understood why Benjamin had summoned them to the abandoned lighthouse. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to astonishment as Margaret carefully revealed the concealed chamber behind the cabinet. Reverend Caldwell removed his hat in silent respect. Dr. Pierce examined the recess without speaking. Martha Rowan simply stared at the iron chest, before tears quietly filled her eyes. "My father always believed Judge Thornton was trying to help us," she whispered. "No one believed him after the judge disappeared." Benjamin addressed the small gathering calmly. "Whatever happens next must happen openly. If this chest contains only ordinary papers, then nothing changes. But if it contains what Judge Thornton intended history to remember, none of us should witness it alone." Every face turned toward Margaret. She stepped carefully before the chest, resting both hands upon the weathered lid. Her fingers hesitated over the faded leather strap before she looked once more at the unbroken wax seal. "Judge Thornton trusted this lighthouse," she said quietly. "He trusted my father. I pray we prove worthy of that trust." With slow, deliberate care, she slipped a small knife beneath the leather binding, without damaging the wax itself. The brittle strap separated easily after nearly 2 decades. She lifted it aside before gently raising the heavy lid. The hinges groaned softly, breaking a silence 18 years old. A faint scent of cedar and old paper drifted into the room. Inside, everything remained astonishingly organized. Neatly bundled documents filled most of the chest, separated by cloth ribbons, labeled with dates and county names. Leather-bound ledgers occupied one side. Several sealed envelopes rested atop the records, each addressed in Judge Thornton's unmistakably elegant handwriting. One envelope simply read, "To whoever opens this chest in honest service to the truth." Margaret carefully lifted it free. The paper had yellowed with age, but remained perfectly preserved. She broke the seal and unfolded several closely written pages. Her voice trembled slightly as she began reading aloud. "If these words are being read, then I have either failed to return or chosen not to return. The distinction matters little compared to what must now be understood. For nearly 3 years, I have investigated an organized conspiracy involving fraudulent land transfers, forged judicial filings, falsified inheritance claims, and systematic intimidation extending across every major harbor between Greyhaven and Northport. Honest families have been stripped of farms, fisheries, warehouses, churches, and businesses through documents manufactured to appear lawful. Those responsible possess influence beyond ordinary criminal enterprise. They have purchased silence where they could, and created fear where they could not. The room remained utterly silent, except for Margaret's steady voice. She continued reading. "I have gathered certified copies of every fraudulent deed presently known to me. I have secured sworn statements from witnesses whose lives would be endangered were these records discovered prematurely. I have preserved original survey maps, proving deliberate alterations to county boundaries. Most importantly, I have identified the financial organization directing these acquisitions through numerous intermediaries." The company presently calling itself Blackwater Shipping Company is not merely purchasing land, it is manufacturing ownership through deception. Martha Rowan covered her mouth to suppress a sob. Reverend Caldwell slowly closed his eyes. Dr. Pierce gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles whitened. Margaret continued. Should these records survive me, they must be delivered only when sufficient evidence exists to expose the entire enterprise, rather than isolated individuals. Justice incomplete often becomes justice denied. I therefore leave these documents beneath the protection of Blackstone Lighthouse, whose keeper Samuel Hale remains one of the few men I trust beyond question. Should Samuel himself never receive this chest, I pray whoever stands in his place possesses equal courage. Margaret's voice faltered briefly as she reached the final paragraph. To Margaret Hale, should Providence place these pages into your hands, remember always what your father already knows. Truth is strongest, not because it cannot be hidden, but because eventually it refuses to remain buried. Guard these records carefully. There are men who would gladly destroy every page to preserve fortunes built upon stolen lives. They will call you foolish, dishonest, dangerous, even criminal. Believe none of them. History belongs not to those who seize power, but to those willing to preserve truth until the proper hour arrives. May God grant you wisdom greater than my own. Silence filled the lantern room once again. No one spoke for nearly a full minute. Finally, Benjamin removed his spectacles and quietly wiped his eyes. Samuel knew, he whispered. Perhaps not every detail, but enough to understand why Thornton trusted him. Margaret carefully placed the letter upon the table before opening one of the ledgers beneath it. Inside rested page after page of meticulously copied property records, banking transactions, shipping manifests, judicial rulings, and handwritten notes connecting names that had never before appeared together. One name appeared repeatedly across dozens of entries: Nathaniel Ashcombe, Victor Ashcombe's father. Beside nearly every fraudulent transfer stood the same discreet notation in Judge Thornton's handwriting: authorized personally. Margaret looked slowly toward Benjamin. Neither of them needed to say what both already understood. Blackwater Shipping Company's corruption had not begun with Victor, it had been inherited. It had operated quietly for decades. And now, thanks to one forgotten lighthouse and one unopened chest, the evidence had finally returned to the light. Unknown to everyone gathered in the lantern room, Victor Ashcombe had already received the messenger's report. Standing inside his office overlooking Greyhaven Harbor, he listened without interruption before dismissing the frightened young employee. Then he walked calmly to the office safe, hidden behind a painting of Blackwater's first warehouse. Unlocking it with practiced ease, he removed an old revolver, a folded map of Blackstone Point, and a yellowed letter bearing his late father's signature. After reading only the first line, Victor quietly whispered, "So, the lighthouse has finally been opened." Then he folded the letter once more, slipped the revolver into his coat, and left the office without informing a single employee where he was going. Victor Ashcombe drove his carriage hard along the coastal road, the iron-rimmed wheels throwing loose gravel against the cliffside as morning clouds gathered over Greyhaven Harbor. He rarely surrendered to emotion, yet for the first time in many years, an unfamiliar feeling settled beneath his calm exterior. It was not fear. Men like Victor Ashcombe had spent entire lifetimes convincing themselves they were incapable of fear. It was something far more dangerous: uncertainty. His father had warned him of only one place that could destroy everything the Ashcombe family had built. "If the lighthouse is ever opened," Nathaniel had written years earlier, "finish what I could not. Do not negotiate. Do not hesitate." Victor had always assumed the warning belonged to another generation. Samuel Hale had died. Judge Thornton had vanished. Benjamin Whitlock had grown old. Time itself seemed to have buried every inconvenient truth. Until yesterday. Until Margaret Hale had purchased a lighthouse no sensible person wanted. Meanwhile, inside the lantern room, Margaret and the others carefully arranged Judge Thornton's documents across the long maintenance table Samuel had built decades earlier. Every bundle revealed another layer of deception. There were forged deeds carrying counterfeit county seals, so expertly crafted that only microscopic imperfections separated them from genuine records. Survey maps had been subtly altered, shifting boundary lines by only a few feet at a time, until hundreds of acres quietly changed ownership without ordinary landowners noticing. Shipping ledgers recorded mysterious payments routed through shell companies with respectable names that concealed their true purpose. Most disturbing of all were sworn testimonies from witnesses whose signatures Margaret recognized immediately. Several belonged to respected townspeople who had supposedly withdrawn their accusations against Blackwater years before. Judge Thornton's notes beside each testimony explained the truth. Every witness had recanted only after receiving threats against their families. Reverend Caldwell slowly lowered one affidavit after another, his face growing increasingly troubled. "These people weren't mistaken," he whispered. "They were terrified." Dr. Eleanor Pierce adjusted her spectacles while examining another bundle of papers. "These signatures are authentic," she said. "I've treated half these families for years. I know their handwriting." Martha Rowan sat quietly, with tears slipping unnoticed down her cheeks. One document described in meticulous detail how her father's orchard had been transferred through a forged inheritance claim supported by witnesses who had both died months before the document itself had supposedly been signed. "He told everyone the papers were impossible," Martha whispered. People thought grief had made him confused. Benjamin rested one weathered hand upon her shoulder. "Your father wasn't confused. He was alone." Margaret continued organizing Thornton's records according to county, carefully comparing his notes with the official ledgers she remembered seeing during childhood courthouse visits. A pattern emerged almost immediately. Every fraudulent acquisition occurred near important coastal access points, deep water harbors, railroad connections, or valuable timber routes. Blackwater Shipping Company had never simply purchased profitable land. They had systematically seized strategic locations until they quietly controlled nearly every major trade route along the northern coastline. Judge Thornton had spent years uncovering the entire network. He wasn't investigating isolated fraud, Margaret realized aloud. He was documenting an organized takeover. Benjamin nodded grimly. One property at a time looked like bad luck. Hundreds together become something else entirely. As the morning progressed, they discovered another leather portfolio, secured beneath the remaining ledgers. Unlike the other documents, this one bore no label beyond a single handwritten sentence. "Not to be opened until the evidence is complete." Margaret exchanged uncertain glances with the others before gently loosening its faded ribbon. Inside rested dozens of personal letters, exchanged between Judge Thornton and Samuel Hale. Margaret immediately recognized her father's steady handwriting. Her breath caught as she unfolded the first letter. "Elias," Samuel had written, "I have noticed unfamiliar vessels anchoring beyond the eastern shoals without reporting cargo to harbor authorities. Their captains avoid the main docks and unload only after midnight. I cannot prove wrongdoing, but I believe these movements relate to the property transfers you described. I will continue recording every vessel that passes my light, regardless of consequence." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Her father had known. Perhaps not everything, but enough to understand that the lighthouse served a purpose far greater than guiding ships safely home. Night after night he had quietly documented movements no one else thought important. Another letter from Thornton answered several weeks later. "Samuel, destroy none of your records. Your lighthouse logbooks may become the single most valuable evidence remaining, should anything happen to me. Trust no official connected to Blackwater's legal advisors. They already suspect someone is preserving information beyond their reach." Margaret looked immediately toward the shelves lining the lower maintenance room. Dozens of lighthouse logbooks still rested there beneath layers of dust. She had planned to preserve them simply because they belonged to her father. Now she realized they might complete Thornton's investigation. Benjamin seemed to reach the same conclusion at precisely the same moment. The logbooks, he whispered. Samuel never threw away a single page. Margaret hurried downstairs, while the others carefully continued reviewing the judge's records. The maintenance office smelled of old paper, lamp oil, and cedar shelves, exactly as she remembered. Along one wall stood nearly 40 leather-bound Lighthouse journals, each carefully labeled by year. Samuel had recorded weather, tides, vessel names, cargo observations, unusual movements, repairs, visitor arrivals, and countless details most people would dismiss as routine. She selected the volumes covering Thornton's investigation years and carried them carefully upstairs. Benjamin opened the first journal. Samuel's handwriting remained neat and remarkably consistent. Every entry recorded exact times and observations without speculation, yet certain vessel names appeared repeatedly, beside tiny stars, penciled discreetly in the margins. Margaret turned to one particular evening recorded less than 2 months before Thornton disappeared. 11:47 p.m. Schooner Raven departed Eastern Shoals without signaling harbour master. Unregistered cargo transferred to Warehouse Pier, despite heavy fog. Judge T. advised. Benjamin quickly searched Thornton's shipping records. There it was. The Raven appeared again, carrying cargo officially declared as imported machinery, while secretly transporting forged printing plates used to manufacture counterfeit county seals. Samuel had unknowingly witnessed nearly every stage of the conspiracy, simply by performing his ordinary duties with extraordinary honesty. Margaret continued comparing journals against Thornton's investigation until another discovery stopped everyone. Folded into the back cover of the final Lighthouse logbook rested a single envelope addressed in Samuel Hale's handwriting. For Margaret, only if I am no longer here. Her hands trembled as she broke the faded seal. Inside rested one handwritten page. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, then life has unfolded in ways neither of us wished. I pray I was wrong about the danger surrounding Judge Thornton's investigation. But if events have brought you to these pages, remember something I failed to teach often enough. Courage is rarely loud. Most days, courage looks like an honest person quietly refusing to surrender the truth. Should the Lighthouse ever become yours again, trust its walls. They have guarded more than ships. And should you discover what Elias feared might one day be hidden here, promise me only this: do not seek revenge. Seek justice. Revenge ends with enemies. Justice ends with peace. Tears blurred Margaret's vision until Samuel's careful handwriting dissolved into soft grey lines. She pressed the letter gently against her chest before quietly folding it once again. Reverend Caldwell lowered his head in silent prayer. Even Benjamin struggled to hide his emotion. The old keeper had known Samuel most of his life, yet hearing his final words felt like losing him all over again. Outside, unnoticed by everyone inside the lighthouse, Victor Ashcombe brought his carriage to a stop behind a cluster of windswept pines overlooking Blackstone Point. Rather than approach openly, he climbed the remaining distance alone, carrying neither walking stick nor satchel. Hidden beneath his overcoat rested Nathaniel Ashcombe's revolver, fully loaded despite decades of careful storage. Victor paused behind a rocky outcrop where he could clearly see movement inside the lantern room windows. 5 figures. More witnesses than he had expected. His expression hardened. Destroying evidence had suddenly become far more complicated. Yet Nathaniel Ashcombe's final instruction echoed relentlessly through his thoughts. If the lighthouse is ever opened, finish what I could not. Victor quietly reached inside his coat, not for the revolver this time, but for his father's yellowed letter. Turning it over, he noticed something he had never bothered reading before. A second sentence written beneath the first in much smaller script. His face drained of color as he slowly whispered the words aloud. Never open the hidden compartment beneath my office safe, unless the lighthouse has already been lost. Victor stared at the sentence in stunned silence. For the first time in his life, he realized his father had hidden secrets even from him. And somewhere beneath Blackwater Shipping Company's headquarters, another cache of evidence might still exist, one capable of either saving the Ashcombe family or destroying it forever.